Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome here. Thank you for joining us on this talk about the PISA assessment. We will take you through the complex history of the development of PISA, highlighting how it has become a key tool for influencing global governance of education. It will delve into the many facets of PISA, shedding light on how it goes beyond a mere assessment tool to become a global communication product. The discussion will explore the complexity of the policy advice that comes from PISA results and reveal the profound impact it has on shaping education policy at the global level. PISA is the OECD's program for international student assessment. It measures 15-year-olds' ability to use their reading, mathematics, and science knowledge and skills to meet real-life challenges. PISA benefits from its worldwide scope and its regularity. Over 100 countries and economies have taken part in PISA so far. Let me introduce you to the participants. Dr. A.C. Lee and János Setényi, to whom I don't need to introduce, the director of the Learning Institute, but let me introduce a bit longer Dr. Lee. She lives in Budapest and the research associate at Debrecen Biodiversity Center. She also teaches at the Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Education, Kazakhstan, where she'd been an assistant professor since 2014. Dr. Lee holds a bachelor degree in business management from Sichuan University, China. She then studied for MSc in comparative and international education at the University of Oxford, followed by a doctorate in educational studies. She specializes in the internationalization of higher education and educational leadership from a comparative perspective. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for accepting our invitation. As I was telling your journey and your studies and your workplaces, I was wondering that you traveled around the world and studied in many places education. You graduated in China, and then moved to Oxford, and started your academic career in Kazakhstan. What's the reaction when you say the word PISA in any of these countries? Does it differ? Are there any connotations referring to PISA?
Thank you for the very generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Like you mentioned just now, I lived in different places. And when I first came in contact with the word PISA, it was actually in 2005 when I started my master's degree in Oxford. So that was the early days of PISA. The program director of my programs happened to be specialized in education in Germany. So if you look into the history of PISA, you would realize Germany had the PISA shock back then. And as a result, PISA shock and global educational policy making was a huge theme in the program I studied. But honestly, I didn't care because in 2005, PISA had no relevance to China, to my personal living and education experience at all. For me, that was a very external aspect of education. However, it took up probably a third of my first semester to talk about PISA. When PISA really made an impact in my life or as an educational researcher was in fact when Shanghai topped the league table. That came as a shock for the British society, especially the English society. If you know the complexity of educational system in Britain, I can't really say British system as a whole. It was mostly the English system, English society that was very surprised by how well the Shanghai students performed. And then the then Secretary of Education, Michael Gove, was so interested in the Shanghai performance that he went to Shanghai and he invited the teachers from Shanghai to teach in an English classroom. And for me, that was, in a way, it was overwhelming. In a way, it was amusing to witness, because only 5 years ago, in 2005, the Chinese way of arranging classroom and the very disciplined classroom was something to be criticized in our program. So we looked at it from a very critical perspective. But then 5 years, because Shanghai topped the league table, it seems like the English society was re-examining there may be some merit and value in this kind of very strict hierarchical classroom structure. So that came as a surprise for me, and I started to think perhaps it was a mistake to study in Britain, because these days the British are now looking at China for inspiration. So that was 2012, towards the end of my doctoral study. After that, I moved to Kazakhstan, and I worked in one of the leading international university in Kazakhstan. I would use the word cautious. My colleagues were very cautious about an international assessment such as PISA within the educational research community. Partly because as an economy, Kazakhstan is an up-and-coming economy. The system is independently gaining its identity from after the fall of the Soviet Union. And PISA provided some criteria and guidance back then for the Kazakhstani schooling system, but it may absorb a lot of resources also from the system, and also add a lot of burdens especially to the teachers and the principals and the schools. So I would use the word, my colleagues was, and they still are, very cautious in reading and applying and interpreting the results from the latest PISA tests. Thank you.
Thank you. János, could you please elaborate on this? As a Hungarian and a European, what does PISA mean to you?
To me or to Europeans?
First, you as an educational expert.
It's a phenomenon which is very interesting, so I studied it. It's obviously a tool of the global governance of education, belongs to the age of the so-called Washington Consensus. If those who are student and not aware of this, it is the 90s. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and the United States is the undisputed leader of the world. They invent internet, and they are really on the top. Washington Consensus is the neoliberal world order with three catching words. One is privatization. The second is decentralization of everything. And the third is deregulation, which is like pushing the state back to a minimum role. And PISA makes education global and makes things comparable. So on one hand, we like it very much. We even like it now. So I tell you later why. And there are some criticisms as well, because it has very useful criteria, evaluation criteria from the point of global employers, so-called competences. This is useful, but pretty much overhyped and over-pushed in the course of the turn of the century. But still, I like it. Imagine when a Norwegian and a Hungarian and, let's say, a Kazakh minister of education, they meet somewhere in the 70s or 80s. It's a painstakingly slow discussion until the night dinner, and the first 1.5 hours goes among the ministers with the waste of time. They are telling about their systems. That in Hungary, teacher training is like this, and this is kind of structural description, and the others are listening, and now it's over. And when you are a minister and you take the airplane, you have the ticket, you check in, and you go, you ask your secretary to give you 3-5 pages about the country you will visit, the educational system, printed pages to read at the airplane, and from 3 pages, 2 pages are basically PISA data. And it helps. It helps. These data should be taken very carefully, of course, but still it helps to put your country into a certain group of other countries, and then you start the negotiation from safe ground. And you don't have to start from scratch. So it's a good thing in that sense. And there is another classic criticism of PISA, old professors usually of education, about knowledge, civilization, and other things which PISA cannot measure. That's a good thing, I mean, as a criticism, and we need a more balanced view about the performance of several educational systems, but PISA has its legitimate part in this international comparison. So this is shortly my impression. I basically like it, personally.
You mentioned deregulation and globalization. Has the aim of this assessment and the history of the evaluation changed over time? Because we've been doing it for more than 2 decades. So what was the original goal of the PISA, and how has it changed, if it has?
Can I continue? Yes, the original goal was, before PISA, President Clinton announced that the American students will be the #1 in mathematics in the world, and then OECD started. Everything seemed to be possible at that. This is the time when US creates the internet, which is the backbone of the modern world now we are living in. And then OECD creates the PISA. They are looking for psychologists first, so not scientists but psychologists, to construct a new evaluation criteria called competences. But this psychologist first rejected this request, telling them that there is no competence without context, cultural context. But then another push happened, and finally these kind of competencies were created. A new type of testing was done, and this is the story. But the PISA train has been hitchhiked. Is it the right English word? When some other people are catching the train and leading it to another direction. That is 2010, when Shanghai joins the PISA. Then came a shock that the East Asians are winning. And then they start to recalibrate the PISA assessment. Is changing. So there is, the first is this Anglo-Saxon competence-based thing. That's the very beginning. And then the East Asians are winning. Japan, the old ones, Korea, Hong Kong, China is still missing. And they say that, okay, of course, these are rote learners, memorization, repeating, shadow education, so and so and so. So the Asians are not serious, they are just learning machines, but that cannot solve problems. And then the tests are recalibrated later, and there will be more problem-solving tasks in the PISA test. By the way, if somebody is about evaluation in education, it is forbidden to modify the tests, because then you cannot compare different PISA results in different years. Okay, so you shouldn't modify. They did, they modified. But again, the East Asians were on the top, and then came the next step of racism, when they told that, okay, they are not just learning robots, maybe they can solve problems, but they are not innovative and creative. So in the latest PISA test, they made new tasks which are measuring innovation and creativity, and again, the East Asians were winning. So we can say that whatever the task is there is an English saying that football is a game which 11 people are playing against another 11 people, and always the Germans are always winning. So PISA is a game that whatever the test is, the East Asians are winning. So yes, it is evolving, and I see now a certain amount of, how can I say, tanácstalanság in English. A certain amount of, there is no new idea what to do now, how to measure. So the new measurements are coming every 3rd year, and the results are published, and always the East Asians are always winning. But this original Anglo-Saxon steam has run out from the program. And there are other measurements as well.
Dr. Lee, how do you see?
as an East Asian who is always winning?
And I actually took the PISA sample test in order to give, before this talk, just to experience it. I did.
You see, I'm a researcher and I didn't. Okay.
I encourage you to go on the website and try it out. Like János mentioned, the test, the way of assessment actually have changed, evolved over the years, from multiple choices to some simple short answers and creativity and innovation. It's in fact, it was very interesting for me to sit the test. I actually have anxiety of taking standardized tests.
And what was your results?
I was very good with multiple choices based on my East Asian exam-oriented training, but I was a bit hesitant to do the writing part. But it's in general, I think, have a look at it. It's very interesting how they assess innovation, creativity, and application of knowledge. The standardized test János mentioned, that they probably have run out of ideas of what else to measure when it comes to assessment and international comparison. So what I see is they are adding more dimensions and context in the assessments. So for example, they have started already collecting the contextual data on the socioeconomic background, on the schools, on the classrooms, on the teaching profession, and started from 2018, so it was the last round of PISA. They are also started to collect the well-being and happiness data of the students. And in the latest round, in 2022, the latest round, so East Asians did not win the happiness index compared to many countries. So almost all these high-performing East Asian societies lost in the happiness index. And OECD said in the next round, they are going to collect even more of, of the data regarding students' well-beings, because it seems the academic performance does not equal to well-being. And perhaps that is something that the OECD wants to look at in the next round of data collection.
Yeah, just one thing to our students, that you see they have found something finally. That although East Asians performing always the best, but they are not very happy. They are depressed, which is true, and their health is not very good because of over-learning. Eyeglasses are very common, and all kind of spine problems. That is one thing. The other is this social background is very important. Hungarian students, they also answered to the question that do you often feel hunger when you simply don't have money in the family and you cannot buy food? I don't remember the percentage, but it was very, very low. And the same percentage as Switzerland. And in the next neighboring country, Romania, it was very high. So sometimes the school performance is very much related to family problems, and this is a very good measurement tool to open these social dimensions. Generally speaking, if you have stable GDP growth in a country, economic growth and growing prosperity, that makes very good for the students' performance in the schools. One example is Poland, where in the past 20 years, a miraculous economic growth has happened, and with the consolidation of the society, with the enrichment of the middle class, school performance is usually improving in a linear way. Not in all culture, like the Gulf countries, Arab countries, but in Europe certainly does.
It's very tempting to go more deep into this happiness part, but in opposition of the OECD, I will stay on the academic side. And János mentioned the comparable side of these changes and evolution of the PISA. So the question naturally occurs that what do we want to compare with the PISA assessment if it changes over time? Do we want to see the different skills children need in the new years, or do we want to compare the countries? Dr. Lee? Or?
Both. The skills were in the center, and you all know the ranking list of PISA. This is very famous. That everybody's looking for her or his own country. That in this year's PISA testing, where is Hungary? That's a basic Hungarian question, of course. You have to know, everybody who has studied a little bit of statistics, that there is such thing as a statistical error error margin, yes, maybe in English, which means that you cannot really say that my country is 22nd and another country with minimal differences like the 23rd. You can't really say that because this error margin makes it ridiculous. You can talk about a certain group of countries which belong together with not so much difference. That's fair. So in the early days of this PISA project, there was a huge debate about this. Should we really publish this ranking list thing, or just a group of countries who belong to each other? And the statisticians were against the ranking list, of course, because mathematically it doesn't make sense. But the real economic it's a Freudian split, the education policy makers told them that you need a ranking list because this is the only document an elected politician in a democracy will read about education in a year. And this ranking list is a major hit because this is understood by decision makers, by politicians. And at least for a month, we can talk about PISA and they listen to. Otherwise, of course, they don't. So it is like a marketing and communication tool, this ranking list. But you personally, if you want to make research on that, you shouldn't take them very seriously. Rather, watch or select the group of countries who are around, a little bit above and a little bit below to your country, and then you have a more or less realistic view about your education system. The other tool is to see the GDP per capita. Usually the results are very much in harmony with your GDP in capita. So there is a more or less linear linkage between the GDP per capita and the PISA results of a certain country. Not in every case. The Middle East countries perform very poorly compared their GDP per capita, and other countries also have great potential to grow and develop.
János mentioned something very important, I think, is the policymakers, they understand the league table, they understand the rankings. What are we comparing when we look at these data? I think one point that OECD emphasized, or at least at the very beginning of PISA, was the results of your country can represent the potential in the future. Meaning that if these 15 years olds, if they are top performers, then perhaps it's very likely your economy, the economy of your society will greatly improve, enhance, or be highly competitive in the near future. So that was an underlying assumption that PISA was trying to represent when they developed the league tables. And of course, decision makers, policy makers, politicians, they understand that nobody wants to see their system, the educational system at the bottom. Nobody wants to be criticized. No policymakers wants to be criticized that they are developing an educational system that does not produce workforce for the future, for the competitiveness of the economy. So I think that was one thing when policymakers, that includes a lot of educational researchers, when they look into the league table, that aspect of employment, of economy, and global competitiveness is something that they are trying to map out in their head.
Let me add something about politicians. It's just a story of the reception of the first Chinese PISA results in China. China joined in 2010. China cannot join, it's too big. So one city was selected to join, it's 20 million people, Shanghai. And it became the top number one, high above everybody. But that was not the plan. And after the public announcement of the PISA results in 2011, I watched the Chinese organs, especially Zhenmin Zhibao, the party, the local Népszabadság, the central newspaper, yes, and for 3 weeks there was silence about this. And then a very little article that according to a certain international test, the Shanghai student fared very well. Why? It was almost secret and seemingly turmoil and a negative surprise, because they just started the liberals, they started to speed up the reform of education in China, more project work and this kind of things, more task-oriented, problem-oriented education, more liberal arts, and so and so and so. And this PISA result was a very strong argument of the conservatives in the Central Committee that, look, we are the number one, we don't need to change things. So it was a catastrophe for them to get to the top of the world. So sometimes you are not happy about these things. Finland is the other story, where the politicians, when Finland lost its number one status after some tests, they were relieved, telling the public that finally we are a normal country and not the whole world is running after us, but we are running in a nice group of the first runners, but we can have our pace, we can have our breath, and we can choose our pace later. We are in a good position. You don't have to be number one because it's terrible. So they were relieved. But for that you need, of course, a very wise kind of sophisticated thinking.
As I understand, there is no only PISA shock when there is a radical decline of their results, but also if you are becoming the first one and you have to lead the ranking. But you were talking about national policies, mentioning these effects. But in the beginning, we also mentioned influencing the global educational landscape. So how does it fit together, or how do they go together, the national policies and the global one regarding the PISA?
OEC has created a chain of a kind of consulting and learning system. So they have country reports, PISA reports. They have missions to the certain countries. They propose policy changes, recommendations. So this whole set which enters national policy implementation were set up by the OECD. Of course, they cannot cover every country. By selected countries, they can. They call it like education policy GPS system. It was designed as a beautiful thing. In reality, it has lost its attractiveness so far. It's still existing, and it's a very nice thing, but not so powerful as it was designed. This week, for instance, the chief architect of this PISA thing, Andreas Schleicher, he's a German person, visited Germany and started to talk about German education policy, and the reaction of the public was hate and rejection. But at least he made big waves in the lake of German education policy.
That's a very big question. But following on what Janos said, going back to the league table, I think the power of league table is once you are in the table, you can't unseen it. You cannot unseen it, especially at the policymakers level. And there has always been a fear of being left behind. So that was something that when I was a student, we talked so much about in the global comparison. Why do we have this kind of league table for global comparison that creates such fear of being left behind in a comparison? And in order not to be left behind, the logical approach many researchers or practitioners or policymakers do is to learn from others. And that is how under the PISA, the so-called performer in the bottom, they tend to look at the top performers, traditionally, for example, Finland, and now a lot of East Asian economies and societies. They tend to look elsewhere to find inspirations and solutions to their problems at home. Now, I mean, it's if you were in as a practitioner or as a policymaker, maybe this, we call it borrowing, getting ideas from elsewhere. It may seem quite easy. You learn, you take it down, you take it apart, you analyze, and then you put it and try to see if it works. But as a researcher, there's a huge problem about the context, whether the East Asian, the system generated, grown in the East Asian system, will actually work. For example, in the Hungarian or Finnish society, that's a huge problem. But the league table, it does provoke the fear, the anxiety of being left behind in a global comparison, and therefore it triggered the learning from abroad activities.
That's a very, very fundamental question. So I agree. You're very diplomatic. You put the question, but I might develop it further to a statement that you can forget this cherry-picking approach. Like you see an Estonian example, a Finnish one, something good from Shanghai, and something very good from Japan. And you take it to Hungary and you implement it. There is an American manager, he died some years ago, Peter Senge, who told, a management guru, he told that culture eats management for breakfast. So the national cultural context is so strong that these examples are very good for inspiration. That's the smart way. So you can be inspired by Estonia or Shanghai for sure, but you have to find your own model, and practically nothing can be imported and introduced into your culture background, because the local people will use this tool in their own way. So, and they don't care about the original things. For instance, if you have these plasma TVs, those very thin, super color TVs, you can import it to the jungle, but when you revisit them 2 weeks later, you will see that they will use it as a breakfast table, which is functional and smart, because they haven't had a breakfast table, and now they have. But the plasma TV's original purpose is not to serve as a breakfast table. You understand? So you cannot really import this kind of things. Every system has its potentials, traditional things which people understand, and the inspirations can come from other countries for sure. And when the two are mixing, that's a very fertile thing. So my adoration, my typical example is the Slovak PISA reflection. I love them. It's very simple. There is an institute who technically managing PISA tests in Slovakia. It's an educational testing institute. And every third year when they have the result, in a press conference, they show the numbers, and the leader announces that because the ministry doesn't pay any analytic job in our institute, we are simply not entitled to reflect to the data, because we don't have such kind of job for trained analysts. So we simply publish the data, goodbye. And that's it. And they give the press the data. So this is when a country rejects learning. And then there are the other extreme, like England, Michael Gove, who introduced Shanghai mathematics in British schools. Well, one methodological point of Shanghai mathematics is that until a single pupil doesn't understand some important things in math, in the lesson, in the classroom should not, and the class should not move further in the lesson. You understand that? So until there is a single child who has a problem with some mathematical process, you can't move further with the lesson. It's impossible in Europe. Nobody wants to wait for little James to catch up with. Of course the teachers move further. It's an individual problem culturally. But no, in the original method, little James or Xiao Liu must understand as others, and there is a community pressure on this little Liu to catch up with, of course. It's a different culture.
It might be a quite provoking question, the next one, but again, it naturally comes up if we are listening to you. That whether these rankings are reliable then, if we can't learn naturally from the first one because we can't really integrate it to our culture, how do we know where to copy from?
Maybe I'll go first. A brief comment on that. I think it's I used the word cautious when I talked about Kazakhstan. I think the caution would be what I used to look at these comparisons. These comparisons, the league table themselves, it's built on the assumption that if you top the league table, then your 15-year-olds will be a better workforce in the future. And perhaps having a better workforce means you have a better performing, more competitive economy, and therefore maybe a better life of everyone. But this is a huge assumption that the league table can be interpreted in such a way to a general society and about a future. So it's useful, in my opinion, it's useful that OECD has started to collect the contextual factors. So from my opinion, to look at the assessment data in combination with the contextual factor is more useful and more informative for anyone involved in policy making and in education, because the contextual factor, they can explain a lot of reasons why some systems, some students perform better than others. They cannot explain everything, but they give you insights into it. But you have to, I think as a researcher, as a policymaker, you have to really make your positionality very clear why you are doing the comparison, looking at the comparison, and what you are trying to draw on. I think one example that I've seen from the 2022 report was, János mentioned very briefly, it was about the food security, nutrition, and mathematics performance. So János cited Hungary as an example. Hungary was really top, like there's very little food insecurity and very high performing mathematics above OECD average. But then there is one country that really fell out of the graph when I looked at it. It was Cambodia. It had really high food insecurity, meaning that the students skip meals very often, a large number of them. And then the mathematics performance was also at the bottom, which tells you that in order for your 15-year-olds, for the children to perform, to study well in school, they need basic food security. So I think the contextual factor that OECD is collecting these days, as a researcher for me, that is more interesting to look at and more informative to look at in combination of the assessments instead of the assessment results themselves.
Let me add one thing that last year I was in Beijing in the Belt and Road Education Conference, and a Cambodian delegate was talking about their educational development strategy, pretty much ambitious, and they want to be a middle-income country within 5 years. They are catching up nicely, and they want, I quote them, a knowledge-intensive economy. And their strategy in education is that digitalization in terms of equipment is coming from China, but the pedagogical methodology of digitalization will come from Singapore, not from China. So extremely sophisticated thinking, very interesting strategy, fastly developing economy from Cambodia. So it's the world is changing, and sometimes when you meet an EU member state delegate or representative of educational policymaking, their views are, I would say, less sophisticated than the current Cambodian educational strategy. So you must be very cautious with globalization, because there are many smart people and interesting policies all around the world.
Thank you. I will have to ask my last question, and then I will give the chance to the audience. So my last question is about the results of 2022. Can you please elaborate on that, or tell us how you see the last year's results, 2 years ago?
But first, IC has to choose an identity. So will you talk about East Asia or Kazakhstan or Hungary or in general?
It's very complicated for me, because I actually looked at the several Chinese economies, and I looked at Hungary, and I also looked at Kazakhstan. So for me, it was a multiple identity there, because I care for all of them. But of course, one society or societies that were missed out was mainland China, because of the school closure. They were not able to collect data for the 2022 PISA. So there was, I think, Hong Kong, Macau, Chinese Taipei, 3 societies represented there. Singapore, South Korea, Japan. So they were, in general, when it comes to mathematics, reading, and science, they all top the league table. But I mentioned before that in the happiness index, these students were very unhappy compared to their peers in other countries. So in my opinion, what struck me most of the 2022 results was the OECD emphasized resilience this time. Yes. Resilience in education, meaning that they try to look at whether the disadvantaged students gain a place in the top performing place. So there were several societies and economies that really stood out, including Kazakhstan. So despite the students being in a really disadvantaged positions, they outperform many of their peers in the so-called developed countries, and also their own peers in their own society. So the resilience is something that I think is very important when we talk about future instead of the final score, but it's actually that kind of spirit. As a researcher, that kind of resilient spirit is really important, that building in every student to tackle the so-called future issues. And another concern that I had when I looked at the result was the disparity of gender in these top performing countries. In all these, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Macau, because my assumption was as time moved on, the gender disparity, the gender gap in science and mathematics should have been closed instead of expanded. But in the 2022 results show that girls in these several top performing countries, they underperform by quite a lot compared to boys. But girls outperform a lot in readings, which is a repetition of the gender stereotype. So that came as a surprise to me. That's my 2 impressions. Thank you.
Janusz, please, can you also highlight the Hungarian and the European results shortly?
The Hungarian is not very interesting. We are there where we are usually. And if you see your GDP per capita data, then we are on our place. Obviously underperforming the Czechs, overperforming the Slovaks, and way overperforming the Balkan countries. Our strengths and weaknesses are the same, And the key of the improvement of Hungarian performance is the leveling up of the underperformance, at least some of them. It's a big group of students, so if you improve that data, statistically speaking, it raised the whole boat. It's a tide. So the number one policy thing is to improve the performance of the underperforming Hungarian students, which we know, of course. In Europe, there is a big measurable decline of well-performing northwestern European countries. So the stronger countries are starting to underperform. We don't know whether it is a stable decline of European performance or is just a temporary phenomenon. It is certainly not COVID and not post-COVID effect. So forget COVID and the lockdown. It's something else. The Germans made something which was unspeakable and unimaginable like 5 years ago. They selected, they broke the data, and they saw the German students and the students with migrant background separately with PISA results they were working with. And the diagnosis is that the German students perform rather well. There was not a big change, but the migrant students are underperforming very badly. And there are two major proposals in Germany to break out from this system, this decline. One is kindergarten. A massive development of kindergarten education. Western European countries don't have that kind of culture and higher education, just qualified kindergarten teachers with degree and this tradition which we have in post-socialist countries. So for them it's a new venture, and there are no kindergarten teachers. So it will be a long-term investment to create a universal coverage of kindergarten where the children can learn German. That's number one, they don't speak German properly. And the second is more interesting. Some circles proposed the prolongation of the gymnasium, the selective academic school, to 9 years, which means that until the kindergarten is created, let the German kids escape from school education as early as possible to the gymnasium, because the gymnasium has very few migrant students. That's just a German picture, a little thing about the inner politic debates. We are, as one Hungarian philosopher, Bele Hamvas said, a pácban mindenki benne van, we are in the sauce. Everybody is in the sauce now. So there is no such a happy European country at the moment. Estonia made rather well, this tiny little country in the Baltics. So they are the new Finns, and they are hyped and marketized, but it has no big effect anymore. So there will be learning and a long, painful period of recovery in the future decade in Europe.
Let me just add one comment, because we talked a lot about Germany, but in Europe it's not only Germany, but other countries as well, which has a great proportion of immigrant students. Their results decline greatly, and it shows especially for those students who don't speak the country's given language at home. So it's a big danger. But moving on, now I give the floor to the audience. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and
we have microphone.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Adam Horvat, and now I'm working for a competence development company, and it is also related to an HR company. So I really relate to what Professor Lee just said about labor force related competence development and understanding that how the people are just performing, because and let's assume that there is no PISA at all. What is there to measure the performance of the educational system? The normal system uses the results of each subject points, or the international Olympics in different subjects, like the math Olympics and the science Olympics and then so on. But these are really, really irrelevant, and actually don't really explain the economic performance of a company, of a country. So there was a need to come up with something else to explain that why we are performing so poorly or why we are performing so good in different aspects. And if you really look at PISA, at the core of PISA, there is the language and the contextual understanding of a problem. And actually, this is something which is really, really missing from other type of educational performance measurements. And this kind of competence to understand that what is the context and how you approach a complex problem or how you handle technology like digital competence became much more relevant in some aspects of the economy and within the whole society as well. And of course, the Germans can be blamed by splitting the results. We could also do that, but not with migrants, but with the very poor Roma population in Hungary. No one would dare to do that, I think. However, that would really, really focus on how you should treat these kind of differences. And this is something, and this is my last sentence, that which probably worth to point it out, that regarding PISA, one of the main points which is pointing it out, the difference between the best performing and the lowest performing children. And usually this is not just personal difference, this is usually, as you pointed it out, it's a social difference as well. And this means that the society, without this kind of data, cannot really handle these differences and get the proportions to solve these problems, because these are problems. So within this perspective, do you think that PISA can be a useful add-on, just a complementary tool, not something which is totally describe the educational performance, but this is something just an add-on to understand that how the educational system is performing?
Lady first. Thank you, Adam, for the comment and the question. I will go back to what I said of caution. So data, large-scale data like PISA, they are always useful. And like János mentioned from at the beginning of his talk, he mentioned that it gives us a base of discussion. So we don't need to start from the very original, from zero. With large-scale data, national data as such, there is somewhere we can begin with. So I see a lot of value in large-scale data like PISA, particularly now that they are collecting the contextual, more and more contextual information to go with the assessment. My caution is still how someone, particularly someone in the position of power, read into the result, and especially whether that kind of international comparison is valid. So I took the food security as an example because in some dimensions it's not worth comparing, because you're just on different dimension, the different areas of the spectrum. So it's not worth to make a direct comparison using the large-scale international data. However, it can inform policymakers on the ground, particularly about the local issues. Perhaps from the contextual factor, contextual data, a lot can be said about why the students perform and have the competence at a high level or a low level, on what can be done in order to tackle the issues related to competence.
János, would you like to add anything? Thank you, Adam, for the question. Please, if you have any questions, raise your hand.
Thank you. My name is Karola Kovács from MCC Transylvania. And I see a tendency that multilingual or multicultural regions perform higher, academically higher than monolingual ones. And by that I mean, I refer to indigenous ethnic minorities. So, for example, South Tyrol performs better than the whole Italy, and as well Transylvania performs better than Romania. And I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on this, and do you see that this tendency can be valuable insight for policymakers?
That's an interesting thing, and the PISA results give a positive feedback about your assumptions. I think it's correct. One explanation is very simple. It's competition. In a multi-ethnic environment, there is always a competition. So let's take this Transylvanian example. Every mixed city has their best secondary schools, Liceo. And both the Romanians and the Hungarians know which are the best schools, and they're very much competing with each other. And they are always watching each other as well. That's a very, very, very good, fertile environment. It was the case in the last century as well, when different church schools were competing. Like the Lutheran schools, they took the Jews as well, and then the Catholic schools and the Calvinist schools, state schools. That's a very healthy environment. But maybe you have a comment as well, because Professor Li belongs to the most mysterious Chinese minority group, the Hakka. And don't forget that among all the revolutionaries in China were Hakka and not ethnic Chinese. And also Deng Xiaoping was Hakka. Was he? No, Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen. All the revolutionary people were Hakka. So do you have, as this competition spirit, Southeast Asia is full of Hakka people who are Chinese only in a way. So how is are you excellent in education as well?
That's actually a question mark, but just as a note, a funny side of historical note. One of the reasons why you saw so many revolutionaries were Hakka. Hakka is a linguistic minority within the ethnic majority. The language Hakka is spoken only by about 1% of the whole population, and it's a dying language. It's the oldest dialect of China. So if you go back to 220 BC, that would be the dialect spoken back then. So it's a very old language dialect. One of the reasons why so many historically at the turn of the century, last century, so many revolutionaries were Hakka, partly because they were so poor that they had to look for education elsewhere, taken up the experimental scholarship program from the Qing dynasty and went abroad to study because the aristocrats could not risk the precious lives of their children, and they became a part of a social experiment on a study abroad scholarships. So that's a funny note of that. But I think János actually raised it's a big question when it comes to PISA in China. In 2018, the result, it included Guangdong province, which was where Hakka, my group, my people, live in Guangdong province instead of Zhejiang. And in that year, the performance of the four, Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Guangdong, the four provinces combined, it just seems that the Chinese performance had declined. And one of the reasons that I read from a lot of articles was the Chinese authorities thought that Guangdong was such a huge province and diverse place with included very wealthy part but also poverty in the province, a huge population that created a problem of the sampling. And therefore, in 2020, in the next, no, I make a mistake, but it was 2000, and then that would be 2015. So in the next round, in 2018, the sampling, Guangdong was kicked out from PISA, but replaced by Zhejiang, which is another coastal wealthy province, but with a much smaller and homogeneous population. And that year, the performance of China came back again. So at the moment, this is so far this is still a mystery, and it actually raised a lot of criticisms from researchers regarding the sampling method in China, as regarding which city and which province could take part in PISA, and how representative it is of the whole Chinese picture.
Sampling back, it's a key of every testing. In this latest PISA, the Finns blamed Sweden with cheating. The Swedes, you can, there is a little amount of space for bargaining about school samples, and within the school population, you will test by PISA tests. There is some flexible place for that. And the Swedes tried to avoid students with migrant background. In other countries, they solve it in a different way. They simply, the teachers tell some students that tomorrow you have flu, you don't have to come, which is the case in Hungarian national competence tests as well, of course. So the word is mixed and everywhere changed. We are very fair in PISA, I mean Hungary. So the selected schools are working with the authorities, and the students just finish the test. Nothing is dependent on the test. So if the students perform very well, no chocolates or extra drinks, nothing. And if they perform very badly, no problem, and the teaching goes after that. But other countries are different. In Estonia, that is a school fiesta when PISA comes in the selected school. So the smaller kids, they get up early and they make sandwiches and drinks at home and they bring to the school. And those students who were selected to write the test, they are considered national heroes. And their mission is to raise the profile of small Estonia, you know. So it's a beautiful celebration, and their approach is completely different compared to the Hungarians. But we are, as usual, we are normal, we don't care. Yes, so it's not a homogeneous thing. Still, we like it. Yes, there is a question from the Kazakh group.
Hello, my name is Asel Batragaliyeva. I'm from Eurasian National University in Astana, Kazakhstan. I came to MCC to internship, and my question is about assessment. In Finland, in Scandinavian countries as Finland, Sweden, they assess people with like a secretly way, not open-minded, and also they don't have everyday assessments like 5 or 4 as in the Soviet Union. But in Kazakhstan we have this system as the Soviet Union. When you have 5 or 4 or 3 in schools. So what do you think about openly assessing people in a grading system?
Yes, for Hungarians, I try to translate. Of course, we have the same system as the Kazakh colleagues. We are all post-Soviet. It is like feleltetés and dolgozat. So a kind of essay writing and oral exam in the morning, and you get the grades for that. But first, let's examine your question. Do you feel your practice problematic? Is it the reason why you asked? Or you want to change it? Or you want to preserve it? What is your personal approach towards the current practice?
I think that people in Kazakhstan tend to have marks rather than have education. Comparatively to Finland or Sweden, to Scandinavian countries, it's my opinion. I think that people should study, should have education for their own mindset, for their own education, for their future, but not for grades, not for assessments. etc.
There is a famous report, the so-called McKinsey report. McKinsey is a global consulting agency, and they are talking about the quality of teachers, but let's forget quality of teachers. It is a universal truth. It's about methodologies as well. Let's say assessment is a good example. And McKinsey says that a certain GDP level and a certain maturity of your education system is needed to change to another level, which means that you can soften your assessment methodology, you can have more trust-based methodologies, you don't need this kind of marking every day, but you can only do it step by step, and you cannot make a radical reform because the people are not ready for that simply. So it comes with economic maturity and educational maturity, and just to have some positive things. Your country is progressing very fast, so my advice, maybe your advice as a half Kazakh by soul, will be different, but my advice whenever I work with Kazakh people is that be a little bit patient. I know you want good, but just wait, because you are on the right track already. You are okay. Just be a little bit patient, and step by step you can make these reforms if you like this kind of assessment things.
I actually like the question Asal posed, because she's already asking that the students should focus on the learning instead on the grades, and education is bigger than grades. So going back to one of the biggest criticism of PISA is that there is a worry that this kind of standardized test may narrow down the purpose of education. But I think your question and your comment actually hit the point that it's more than a grade, but it's about your whole learning experience. And my experience teaching in Kazakhstan in the past 10 years is students in our school, because we don't use the five point, we use a very extensive summative assessment method. So the students on day one, they would come to the instructors and argue over a 0.5 grade. Why did you take 1 or 0.5 points off my grade? That usually tend to happen on day one. And then instructors like us, we usually explain to them that this is not about 1 or 0.5 grades. If you keep pursuing, I can deduct more, because there are more flaws in your work than actually merit. But we try to find merit because that's the actual learning. And then we point out what can be improved in our extensive feedback. But this is, like János said, it's going to be a very long journey for the whole system. Right now, I'm only talking about my classroom of 25 or 50 students. As a system, it's going to take a long time to transit from the 5-point UNT to a more comprehensive competency-based assessment.
Thank you for the comments and the questions. Please raise your hand if you have any other. If there are no more questions, would you like to add anything, János?
And just that, let's open the floor for informal discussions. Still, if you want to mix with us and ask questions personally, it's still okay. And maybe we still have this ajándék. Okay.
Let me just say goodbye to those who have to leave, and have a good evening. Thank you for joining us, and Dr. Lee, thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for your questions.